Hi, Brian Lehrer here. Up next, Brian Lehrer Weekend. 3 of our favorite segments from the week packaged together for you to listen to on the weekend. So enjoy, and I'll see you back on the radio Monday at 10 a.m. on WNYC and WNYC.org. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. With us now, the apparent incoming Speaker of the New York City Council, Julie Menin. Councilmember Menin was already scheduled to come on with us in this slot to talk about her plans for leading the legislative branch of government in the Mayor Zohran Mamdani era. And yes, we will talk broadly about that. Their shared interest in affordability, including universal child care and more. Some of the media reports that label her a moderate who might be a check on Mayor Mamdani, the socialist in some ways and other things, but the horrific events of this weekend, the mass shootings in Australia and in Brooklyn, also the one at Brown University in Rhode Island, and the stabbing of a tourist at Macy's on Friday as she was changing her baby's diaper. Each of those things is not only a tragedy and a crime, but also raise security and policy questions for the city. So we will try to cover some of that ground in good faith as well. By way of background, for those of you who don't know, Julie Menin had been a lawyer and a restaurant owner and became a community leader in Lower Manhattan after the 9/11 terrorist attack in 2001. She first became known citywide in that role through her efforts at helping the area recover and rebuild. She went on to be elected chair of Community Board 1 downtown, and then to hold 3 roles in the de Blasio administration: Consumer Affairs Commissioner, Director of the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment, and then head of the city's U.S. Census effort in 2020. She got elected to council from District 5 on the Upper East Side in 2022. You know, she's been on the show in each of those past roles, everything I just enumerated, and now apparently has the support to become Speaker when that vote officially takes place in council next month. Julie Menin will also be the first Jewish Speaker of the City Council, even as Zohran Mamdani becomes the first Muslim mayor, so the city is making history now in both of those ways. Councilmember Menin, congratulations on your apparent path to becoming Speaker, and always good to have you. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be back with you again.
And listeners, it can be my questions and yours for presumed incoming Council Speaker Julie Menin at 212-433-WNYC. Call or text 212-433-9692. Councilmember, let's let our listeners know a little bit more about you first. Then we'll get into the awful events of this weekend and your larger vision for the city. Anything you want to add to my thumbnail bio or correct of your history in government and public life?
Well, thanks, Brian. I really appreciate it. I've been involved in public life for over 20 years. I began my career first as a regulatory attorney working at a large law firm and then as in-house counsel at Colgate-Palmolive, where I did regulatory law, and then I left the practice of law to open up, as you said, my business, which was a restaurant and catering business and market. This was in 1999, so before 9/11. I was living down there at the time. My business was located 2 blocks from Ground Zero. My business was absolutely devastated on 9/11. My husband was supposed to be in the World Trade Center for a meeting that morning, and thankfully he was okay. But obviously, I became very involved after 9/11 in the rebuilding of the community that I lived in. And I started a not-for-profit focused on helping small business and residents and ended up chairing Community Board 1 in Lower Manhattan for 7 years post 9/11. And that's really how I got involved in public service and have been honored to be able to serve in public life since that time.
What motivates you in politics and public service today? Any central organizing values or goals?
It's really about trying to get things done, trying to move the needle. In all the roles that I've had, I served as Commissioner of the Department of Consumer Affairs, where we launched a paid sick leave law, the living wage law, where I presided over the agency and made it consumer and worker protection, where we, for the first time, were able to pass laws and implement laws that protected workers. Because at the end of the day, the city cannot have a Department of Labor. We're preempted by the state, but we can build out the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, which which is what we did when I was commissioner. So in terms of guiding principles, I have focused really my life's work on consumer protection, on worker protection. They're things that I'm very deeply passionate about, and I'm passionate about making sure that city government is really working for New Yorkers and that we are protecting vulnerable New Yorkers, that we are protecting small businesses, that we're attracting new businesses to our great city so that we're making sure that we're always creating jobs and really supporting new revenues so that we can build more affordable housing, have the funds that we need to build great schools for our children, build more parks, and all the things that New Yorkers depend on.
Many people were surprised by how quickly council members came to support your bid to be Speaker, especially versus Crystal Hudson, who, for example, the New York Times describes as more aligned on policy with the mayor-elect. And the article notes she is a member of the council's Progressive Caucus. Should I take it from that you are not in the Progressive Caucus?
I joined the Progressive Caucus, Brian, when I was first elected in 2022, but 15 members, including myself, left the Progressive Caucus because at the time there was a pledge that you needed to sign, and embedded in that pledge said that we would work to reduce the size and scope of the NYPD budget, and that was not something that I felt comfortable signing or that the other 14 members who also left the Progressive Caucus felt comfortable. But at the end of the day, I've done a lot of progressive things in my career. I launched a paid sick leave law, the living wage law. I was the 2020 census director, where I was honored to run the census for New York City. We finished number one of all cities across the country. I also served in a senior role at the New York City Law Department at that time, where we were a plaintiff on the citizenship case, along with the New York Attorney General, and we successfully sued the Trump administration, got the citizenship question off of the census. So again, I think ideological boxes really don't always make sense. I think what I've really tried to focus my time on are again, on substantive issues that protect vulnerable New Yorkers, that protect immigrant communities. I'm the daughter of an immigrant, and that really move New York City forward. I'm also a small business owner. So, for example, when I served as Commissioner of Consumer Affairs, I lowered fines on small businesses. Small businesses were getting socked with thousands of dollars in fines because one word in a sign was incorrect. So that is something that I've also been incredibly focused on, and I've also been focused on lowering skyrocketing health care prices. The council passed my bill 2 years ago that created the nation's first Office of Health Care Accountability. That office is now up and running at the Department of Health, and that office is charged with lowering skyrocketing health care prices and lists the price of every medical procedure at every single New York City hospital. So it really brings transparency to an opaque process, because oftentimes, Brian, when you're at the hospital, it's your most vulnerable time, and yet you come home and you get an enormous bill. So, for example, a woman giving birth by C-section who goes to one New York City hospital is charged $55,000 for that C-section. Yet at another New York City hospital, that same C-section is $17,000. That's absurd. By bringing transparency to this opaque process, it will allow New York City to harness its purchasing power as the second largest purchaser of healthcare in the state and drive down costs.
I see that you're aligned with the mayor-elect on aiming for a universal child care program. What kind of system do you envision, and how much is that the same as the mayor-elect's?
So in 2022, the New York City Council passed a package of bills on child care. I had 5 bills in that package. And the key bill in my package was a bill that would have required New York City to implement universal child care within 5 years of the bill's passage, which again was 2022. The Adams administration largely did not implement those packages of bills beyond really rudimentary basics. So I'm deeply committed to universal child care. Child care on average is costing families $21,000 a year. It's simply unaffordable and not accessible for the vast majority of New Yorkers. We must move towards universal child care. And there's also, Brian, an economic cost to this as well. We've had had about 300,000 parents in recent years leave the New York City workforce because they couldn't find affordable childcare. The cost to New York City of those parents leaving the New York City workforce was about $2.2 billion economically. So not only is universal childcare normatively the right thing to do, but it's also economically and fiscally the right thing to do. So I'm deeply committed to universal childcare. I've been committed to it for years, as evidenced by the fact that I work so hard on this legislative package. So I'm very excited to work with the mayor-elect on implementing universal childcare. And in terms of your question, well, what is the right way to do it? Well, first of all, we obviously have 3K and pre-K, although we do need to work harder to make sure that every single 3K student has a seat that is near their home, and so that's something we're going to focus on. But really we need to do more for 0 to 2, because if you're a parent of a child that is 0 to 2, there's very little available to you. So we absolutely need to do more on that. If we were to do universal child care, for example, for all 2-year-olds in New York City, that would cost us about $1.3 billion a year. We need to look at, I know the mayor-elect has focused on 0 to 5, we need to really look at all of these ages because, for example, if your child is in 3K or pre-K, but your workday obviously is not ending in the afternoon, it is very difficult. So we need to make sure that we're also working on extended day opportunities for those families as well. So I'm very excited about universal child care and deeply committed to making it happen.
Well, Governor Hochul also says yes in principle to universal child care, but she hasn't committed to the tax hike on the wealthiest New Yorkers and on corporations that the mayor-elect thinks might be necessary to pay for it. Do you think those tax hikes are needed to make your vision a reality?
Well, I think what we need to do as a city council, and what we will obviously plan to do, is go up to Albany, and not just on Tin Cup Day, but really go up there early and often to talk not only with the governor, but with legislative leaders about the importance of universal child care. As I said before, there's an economic issue as well at play here, and that is the lost economic output, the $2.2 billion in lost economic output by not providing universal child care. What I would like the city council for us to focus on is where we can be value added at identifying savings at the city level. So I'll give you 2 examples of that. One example is no bid contracts. During the Adams administration, as well as the de Blasio administration, there was a prolific use of no bid contracts. I had a bill in the council that I introduced over a year ago that would ban the use of no bid contracts beyond the true impact of an emergency, which should be no more than 30 days. So for example, in the Adams administration, why did it cost $4 billion a year to house asylum seekers, and why did the Adams administration constantly engage in no-bid contracts with companies like DocGo or even the New York Hotel Association, which received 2 $1.1 billion contracts? The problem with no-bid contracts, Brian, is that there's no competitive bidding. And as someone who used to own a small business, no small business owner would go with just one bid, the highest bid. That's nonsensical, and it's not the way to run city government. So if we could eradicate the use of no-bid contracts beyond the use of 30 days, we could potentially save billions of dollars a year. And by the way, those no-bid contracts were used in the de Blasio administration as well, because the no-bid contracts were extended over 100 times to the tune of $7 billion, which is why the city administration spent quite a lot of money on PPE because they were using no-bid contracts. So that is one potential areas of savings that I am very excited to talk to the mayor-elect about. The second area of savings that I think we absolutely must utilize is this healthcare issue that I mentioned before. The new Office of Healthcare Accountability that was created under my bill is estimated to save the city of New York potentially $2 billion a year. How? Because we are spending $11 billion a year currently, or 10% of our New York City budget, on public sector and retiree health care. $11 billion. That number, Brian, just 5 years ago was $6 billion. So it's almost doubled in 5 years. And the reason why is because the hospitals are charging so much money for various procedures. And before my bill came into law, we as a city didn't even know what the hospitals were charging frequently. So we couldn't harness our purchasing power to drive down costs. So I'm excited about this area. I strongly believe, and studies have shown, we could save $2 billion a year if we utilize this office correctly, which is what I absolutely plan to do. And by identifying those city savings, that will help us to be a real player in the affordability agenda and on finally, once and for all, implementing universal child care.
With the presumed incoming Speaker of the New York City Council, Julie Menin, I want to ask you about this especially awful weekend of mass shootings in the city and outside of it. You, of course, know these things. The apparent anti-Jewish massacre of 15 people plus 38 injured is the last number I saw at the Hanukkah celebration on Bondi Beach in Sydney, Australia. Anti-Semitic hate crimes have also been rising in New York in recent years. As you know, Mayor Adams announced increased security at synagogues and public menorah candle lightings. Mayor-elect Mamdani released a statement that I want to read a little bit of for our listeners. It says, "This attack is merely the latest, most horrifying iteration in a growing pattern of violence targeted at Jewish people across the world." The mayor-elect said, "Too many no longer feel safe to be themselves, to express their faith publicly, to worship in their synagogues without armed security stationed outside. What happened at Bondi is what many Jewish people fear will happen in their communities too." And he said, "When I am mayor, I will work every day to keep Jewish New Yorkers safe on our streets, our subways, at shul, in every moment of every day. Let this be a purpose shared by every New Yorker, and let us banish this horrific violence to the past." All of that, unquote, from Mayor-elect Mamdani. So as the presumed incoming city council speaker, are there things at the security or policy level that you think the city needs to do to prevent these kinds of hate crimes? And how much do you see eye to eye with the incoming mayor from what you could tell?
Well, first of all, what happened in Sydney is horrific. I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. My mother and grandmother survived the Holocaust in Hungary. My grandfather did not survive. He was killed simply because he was born Jewish. And when my mother and grandmother made it through the Holocaust, they stayed in Hungary and stayed for a number of years under Soviet occupation. They then escaped in the middle of the night to Czechoslovakia, and the only country, Brian, that would let them in was Australia. And they ended up settling in Sydney, where the Jewish community in Sydney, Australia, welcomed my mother and grandmother with open arms, and they stayed there for 6 years during my mother's childhood. There had been reports from religious leaders in Sydney and community leaders who warned of the growing tide of anti-Semitism in Sydney. But unfortunately, those cries were largely not heeded, and now we have the horrific terrorist attack from yesterday. And it's absolutely abhorrent, and it's unacceptable. And it's not only in Sydney, it's happening really all over the world right now with the rise of anti-Semitism. To me, the best way to fight anti-Semitism is through education. There was an article that I read about a year ago that said that 34% of young people in the United States believe the Holocaust is a myth or was exaggerated, 34%. And so as a result of reading that statistic, I created a program about a year ago at the Museum of Jewish Heritage here in New York that brings every 8th grade public school student in New York City to the museum, to the permanent Holocaust exhibition, to walk through the museum, to learn about the Holocaust, and then there's a curriculum that teachers can utilize to teach about the Holocaust. This is a time where we need to double down on fighting anti-Semitism. We need to obviously make sure that hate crimes divisions at the NYPD are properly resourced. We need to make sure that the Human Rights Commission at the city government is properly resourced. It oftentimes takes them over a year to close out investigations, and not just on anti-Semitism, on all forms of hate, and that's simply unacceptable. I do believe that, obviously the election of the first Muslim mayor, and if, assuming the vote on January 7th, I would be the first Jewish speaker, that is very exciting. And this is a time to come together. When I chaired Community Board 1 in Lower Manhattan for 7 years after 9/11, I stood up for the Islamic Cultural Center and Mosque. I actually wrote the resolution for my community board and got that resolution through the community board supporting that project. This is a historic time where the Muslim and Jewish communities can come together. An example I like to give, Brian, is that after October 7th, a young student in my district in high school who is Muslim came to me and said that her best friend is Jewish, and at their high school they created a club, a joint club for Muslim and Jewish students to discuss issues, to come together. That is more of what we need in this city.
We have a caller kind of on that note, I think. Aaron in Astoria, you're on WNYC with presumed incoming City Council Speaker Julie Menon from District 5 on the Upper East Side. Hi, Aaron.
Good morning, Brian, and good morning, council member. Thank you for being on, taking calls, and thank you for your words today about coming together in that way. I wanted to ask about your colleague, Vicky Palladino, on the City Council. I'm sure you're aware she's a long history of anti-Semitic, racist, white supremacist comments, as well as threatening violence and murdering her political opponents. This morning, I don't know if you saw, or I guess last night, she took the step of saying that we should expel all Muslims from the United States and denaturalize all Muslim U.S. citizens. You have proudly touted her support when you ran for Speaker, and she helped you secure the nomination for Speaker, along with the entire MAGA Republican faction of the City Council. I just wanted to ask your thoughts on her comments, and if you would support expelling her from the City Council, and if not, why do you think her conduct is tolerable? Thank you.
Well, first of all, blaming Muslims for the attack in Sydney is dangerous, it's inflammatory rhetoric, and it's unacceptable. We saw this type of rhetoric certainly after 9/11, the same type of Islamophobia, which is why, as chair of Community Board 1 in Lower Manhattan post 9/11, as I mentioned, I stood up for the Islamic Cultural Center and Mosque. I wrote the resolution that got it through my community board. I got it passed through the community board, and we proudly stood up for that project. I ended up having death threats as a result of that. This is a time to come together. I will obviously be talking to Councilmember Palladino about these comments. We cannot allow this kind of rhetoric to stand, and it's obviously not the time for it, and it's never the time for it. So this is a time for us to all come together and not to have this kind of incendiary, inflammatory rhetoric.
Should council take action to censure or expel her, as the caller suggests?
We have very strong rules in the council. We have an ethics committee. The process is that matters are referred to the ethics committee for a vote, and that is how the censure process works. So that is absolutely up to the vote of the ethics committee. In January, we will be naming all the committees. We'll be naming the chairs of all the committees, including the chair of the ethics committee, and that will be a matter for them to take up. But to be clear, I do not support those comments. I denounce those comments, and they are extremely troubling.
But you don't want to take a position, it sounds like, on whether a censure or expulsion is warranted. Why not?
Well, it's not up to the speaker under our council rules. It's up to the ethics committee. So basically how the process works is a complaint is filed, the ethics committee meets, and then the ethics committee makes a decision on whether they're going to censure. So it does not, under our council rules, it's not up to the speaker, it's up to the ethics committee. So we have to follow those rules. But to be clear, I completely disavow those comments and find them absolutely derogatory.
Another listener question on affordable housing, which you brought up earlier. Listener writes, if your guest is serious in addressing the urgent need for affordable housing, would she support a moratorium on all forms of housing development other than affordable housing for the duration of Mamdani's first term? Piecemeal approaches of setting aside 10 or 15% of development projects will never approach what is needed, writes that listener. Your response?
So one of the things that I'm very interested in the council doing is a proactive affordable housing plan, and that involves looking, for example, at the over 1,000 sites, some of which are vacant land, some of which are underutilized or under-purpose buildings owned by the city of New York. We need to look at those 1,000 sites and see where we can build more affordable housing. So that is a historic opportunity. I'm also interested in looking at the public library branches. There are 215 of them. Many of them we can build on top of. That's another area of real opportunity to build more affordable housing. The council has largely been reactive, in my opinion, on some of these issues because we wait till ULURP comes to us, or that's our land use process, and then the council member who's districted in negotiates, as opposed to putting out a proactive plan. We have a golden opportunity to look at these sites that the city owns, look at the public library branches, and see which sites are suitable for affordable housing. And so that, I think, is a golden and historic opportunity, and one that I really look forward for the council to dig in on that level of work.
I know you got to go in a minute. I know there are two recent pieces of legislation of yours that are really interesting and that you would love to talk about, and I want to give you that opportunity. One is to set up a local census office 2 years before each census. You got a lot of praise for directing the 2020 census effort, which, from what I've read, did a good count of New Yorkers. And the other one to require 2 EpiPens per child who might need one in every school. You want to shout out those bills?
Thanks, Brian. I do. So on the census, I served as the 2020 census director for New York City, where we were under immense pressure on the census. We were able to fund 150 community organizations on the ground that were their trusted voice in their neighborhood. We launched 36 media campaigns in 27 different languages. We funded the 215 public library branches, which again were trusted voices within their respective communities. And we obviously were a plaintiff on the citizenship question case, which we, along with the New York Attorney General, won that case at the U.S. Supreme Court and bounced that question off the census. House Republicans have now tried to put the citizenship question back on the radar. There's legislation in Congress to add the citizenship question back on the census, which would have disastrous implications for blue cities like New York City that have large immigrant communities, and so that is unacceptable. The bill that the council passed my bill last week, will create a permanent office of the census, so we can start that work now. It's estimated that we could lose potentially 3 congressional seats in New York State, and let me be clear, we have lost a minimum of 2 congressional seats every decade since 1950, except for 2020, when we lost 1 seat and we came within 89 people of losing 0 seats. So that is why it is imperative that we begin the work on the census now, because we've got over 300 programs, SNAP, Head Start, hundreds of programs, Title I funds for schools that vulnerable New Yorkers depend on. We cannot lose out on that federal funding, and we cannot lose out on the congressional representation. And finally, by having a permanent office of the census that begins that work 2.5 years prior to the beginning of the census, we will ensure that New York City receives its fair share of funding and representation. And then lastly, on the EpiPen bill, my son had food allergies. We almost lost him when he was 2.5 years of age due to a very severe anaphylactic reaction. And it was only 2 EpiPens, not 1, but 2 EpiPens that saved his life. The bill that the council passed was my bill that mandates that every school and child care facility across New York City must carry life-saving EpiPens. This is mission critical because so many children have food allergies, and yet the parents are not aware that their child has life-threatening food allergies. So I'm very proud that last week the council passed both of these pieces of legislation.
Very good. Well, the time went so fast. There are so many other things we could talk about. So assuming the official vote goes as expected in January, best of luck as Speaker the next 4 years, and we look forward to speaking with you many times.
Thank you so much, Brian, for having me. I appreciate it.
Julie Menon, the presumed incoming Speaker of the New York City.
I am Nina Khrushcheva, the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev. the leader of the Soviet Union in 1962.
And I'm Max Kennedy, the nephew of U.S. President John F. Kennedy. We explore what was a terrifying moment in history.
The story of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
How close the world came to nuclear war.
And what they had to do to pull it back from the brink.
The bomb, Kennedy and Khrushchev.
Listen on bbc.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Council. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. You know, one of the things we've been following on the show this year is the life and death impact around the world of the severe cuts in U.S. foreign aid. Also, the U.S. cutting way back on refugee resettlement, like looking to send back many people from Afghanistan, even those who helped the U.S. during the war there, whose lives would presumably be endangered by returning them to the Taliban-run country. And there's new news on these fronts this morning. It comes from the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, which helps refugees and other people affected by humanitarian crises around the world. Some of you know it was Albert Einstein who founded the organization that became the IRC back in the 1930s to help support refugees fleeing the Nazis, now known as the International Rescue Committee. They are out today with their annual emergency watch list report. But this year, in addition to listing the 20 countries that they cite as the most at risk of worsening humanitarian crises, and we'll go down some of that list, the emergency watch list report has a subtitle, New World Disorder, Driving Unprecedented Humanitarian Crises as Global Support Collapses. So, on that collapse, the report cites a stat that global humanitarian funding has shrunk this year by 50%, by half. That downward dive led, as you might imagine, by the United States, considered in the past the anchor of the global aid system. On the notion of a new world disorder, that phrase, that title, this is not just a money flow issue. The IRC says the global system previously based in rules and individual rights is being dismantled, leaving a void that becomes an incentive to use war as a tool for power and profit, an incentive for using war as a tool for power and profit. The result, they say, obviously, is more death, hunger, and displacement of civilians. Now, the report includes 10 goals for the coming year, and they include not simply getting aid to people who need it immediately, but also structural things for this new world disorder environment, like analyzing who profits from violence to help disrupt those illicit networks and recommitting to international refugee protections. With us now, the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, David Miliband, the former British Foreign Secretary. David, we appreciate that you're making us one of your stops as your report comes out this morning. So important. Welcome back to WNYC.
Brian, I appreciate you very much and really am looking forward to this conversation. I really appreciate you giving us the space because these are big issues and too often they get ignored.
Can you explain more about why you titled this year's report, The New World Disorder?
Yes, I think that's a great place to start. The New World Disorder is what our teams see every day in the 30 to 40 countries that they work in around the world. Countries led by Sudan at the top of the emergency watch list, the threat list, if you like, for 2026, the gravest humanitarian crises. And what they're seeing is precisely what you hinted at in your introduction. The rules and the rights that were established after the Second World War were never absolute. There was never a golden age, but those rules and rights set a benchmark. What we're seeing in places like Sudan, in Gaza, in South Sudan, in Ethiopia, number 4 on the watch list, in Somalia, where I was last week, what we're seeing is a world without rules and a world without rights. And that's the product of very big changes in global politics that have neutered international cooperation on diplomacy, on climate change. Those are political trends that have facilitated the profiteering from conflict that we see every day in Sudan. The gold trade is booming in war-torn Sudan, and it's producing the trampling on individual rights that is absolutely critical for civilians who are caught up in war, 50,000 of them killed over the last year, but also the refugee issues that you mentioned. And so the new world disorder is simply the daily reality that our teams see outside their windows every day. Just final point, as needs remain very high, as impunity reigns in the places that we work, the cash support that goes in to support health programs, water and sanitation programs, vaccination programs, economic livelihoods programs, that has been slashed by, yes, 50%. And I just want to put that into dollar terms for you. Was it 50% of about $26 billion was spent on humanitarian aid? That's the life-saving work. And we've lost about 12 to $13 billion of that aid. So we're facing a crunch. On the one hand, the needs are at historically very high levels, 60 conflicts going on around the world. But the mitigation, the life-saving support has been cut back. And the disorder, of course, is accelerated by those cuts.
How much of that cut is specifically a reduction in U.S. foreign aid?
Well, it's very hard to get the figures out at the moment. So we haven't finished 2025. The final amounts have not been declared. What we know is that Secretary Rubio announced much earlier in the year that 83% of U.S. aid grants and contracts, some of them coming through the State Department, some of them coming through the USAID independent agency, 83% of grants and contracts had been cut off. That's not the same as the total cash loss. But to put it in some kind of perspective, the US represented $1 in every three, more or less, of total aid spending, humanitarian aid, or other forms of aid. And so I think that in the humanitarian aid basket, the reduction of $12, $13 billion of the most basic forms of aid, the US proportion of that is likely quite high.
So let's linger for a minute on the effect that's having on actual people around the world. I want to play a clip from this show on October 6th. It's Meg Kelly from the Washington Post on her reporting about the pause in medical aid. This is just one of the things in this category, but the pause in medical aid that the Trump administration ordered very early on.
The sort of time period that we looked at, which is the first 6 months of the year, the first half of the year, we found that there were $190 million worth of, or more than $190 million worth of supplies that were meant to be delivered during that time period. And they were meant to go to 41 countries. So it's a pretty wide swath of the world that was expecting either HIV or malaria commodities during that time. And by the end of June, we found that nearly or almost half of that medication and supplies had not been delivered. It was, in warehouses, it hadn't left manufacturers, it was sitting in customs, it was in transit.
Meg Kelly from the Washington Post here in October. So David Miliband from the International Rescue Committee, I wonder if there's an IRC experience with that halted medication and medical supplies. She mentioned malaria and HIV in particular, with that flow, that you can pick it up from there on and put even more of a human face on it with respect to people who the IRC serves.
Yes, I think it's very important to follow that up. Let me give you an example that derives from East Africa. I mentioned that Sudan is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, 30 million people in humanitarian need. About 3 million of the Sudanese population have crossed into neighboring states, Egypt, Chad, but also South Sudan, which itself is a very poor country. The program that we can highlight was for Sudanese refugees in South Sudan. It above all met their health needs. It was a $5 million program or so, and it was cut off. And that means that people aren't getting absolutely vital medical care, nutritional support, etc. And these are people who've lost everything in the course of the so-called civil war, the internal war in Sudan. They were counting on the services that they're receiving from us, and they're no longer getting them. I'm afraid that pattern has been repeated for us in about 50 different grants and contracts that have been cut off. Some of them at the real hard end, like this South Sudan example. Others, the largest education program for children in Afghanistan, boys and girls, cut off. So there's a very human face for this. In total, about 2 million of our clients have lost services that they were previously getting. And of course, the very high likelihood is that they're not being replaced.
And I don't know if you're trying at all to document or estimate how many people are actually dying as a result of the sudden drop-off of U.S. and other humanitarian aid. But I want to play an exchange from September between Secretary of State Marco Rubio and ABC's George Stephanopoulos on this question. As Secretary of State, and that's, of course, the U.S. equivalent of your old job for the U.K., Foreign Secretary, you'll hear Rubio first blame others for any deaths, and Stephanopoulos follow up on that sounding like an admission that people are, in fact, dying. Listen.
Then they died because England didn't give enough money, or Canada didn't give more, or China did. Let's blame the other countries that don't do any foreign aid. How about China? I mean, China's the second largest economy in the world. They don't give money to these projects.
So you're no longer disputing that the aid cuts have cost people's
money?
lives. You're no longer disputing that.
It didn't. I think anybody who tells you that somehow it's the United States, if we cut $1, somehow we're responsible for some horrific thing that's going on in the world is just not true. Beyond that, I would say that in some of these places
that
they cite,
not going
the reason
to
why the
feeding
aid
someone
didn't
or
get
medicine,
there,
someone's going to die,
one of the
they?
reasons why some of these places didn't get the aid is not because we cut the aid. It's because there's a war going on and the aid never got to the people.
Marco Rubio and George Stephanopoulos in September. So, David, I'd like your reaction to that clip, and also if you have any estimate at the IRC of how many lives this year's changes are costing.
I think that the most informed, data-driven estimate comes from a look across the humanitarian landscape. So it wouldn't be right just to have one agency. We're a significant part of the humanitarian sector, but we're not the majority part, anything like it. And the most data-driven estimate comes from the highly respected medical journal, The Lancet. I'm sure you've had contributors from The Lancet on your show. 1.5 million people have died in 2025, according to The Lancet. That's the best estimate of the consequences of all the aid cuts. Now, of course, Secretary Rubio is right to say that it's not only the United States that's reducing its aid, but as I said before, the US was $1 in every 3, so it's a very significant part of it. And so it plays a critical leadership role. But in answer to your question, there is serious work being done by responsible organizations to try and document it. And that is the Lancet's best estimate so far. As I say, it's still work in progress. There's still a couple of weeks of the year to go, not least. But that's so far the best sector-wide estimate.
Listeners, as we continue to follow the sudden decline in U.S. foreign aid and what the International Rescue Committee calls in its new report the global collapse, as well as New World Disorder, we invite your stories and comments and questions. 212-433-WNYC. If you have any ties to any country experiencing the effects of this global collapse in humanitarian aid, help us report this story. 212-433-WNYC. Don't be shy. If you come from anywhere in the world, originally, countries that might be on this list of 20 at a special risk, or anywhere else, 212-433-9692. If you have any ties to any country experiencing the effect of this global collapse, do feel free to help us report this story with a story, an anecdote, something somebody told you on the phone, a relative, a friend, a business associate back there, or anyone else too can make a comment or ask a question. 212-433-WNYC, call or text 212-433-9692 with David Miliband, former UK Foreign Secretary, now President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, 212-433-9692. David, I saw you on TV this morning saying the EU is picking up some of that aid, but also notably China is stepping into that void. I want to take each of these. On the EU part of that, again, you used to be the UK's foreign secretary. England was the first country that Rubio in that clip cited, if they're cutting off aid. But how, from your experience, would those decisions be getting made in European capitals today? I know one U.S. argument, I'm sure you know this, is that the other wealthy countries of the world, European ones especially, have been taking advantage of the U.S. largesse for a long time on humanitarian aid as well as military spending to defend Ukraine, for example. But on humanitarian aid in particular, which is our topic today, it's time for Europe to step up if they really believe in these things as they claim. So are the UK and other European countries taking that position seriously, and should they?
Well, there are 27 countries in the European Union. UK is outside the European Union. Norway is an important European country outside the European Union. Here's the picture. Those European countries are starting from a much higher base of commitment to international aid as a share of national income. The shares in Europe, 0.7% in Sweden and Denmark. It used to be 0.7% in the UK. In the US, it's about 0.2% of national income that goes into foreign aid. So from a higher base, Europe is actually cutting back, but it's not a good argument that there needs to be more burden sharing between the US and Europe. The truth is that it's the newly emerging countries, notably in the Gulf but elsewhere, where there's a good case for burden sharing. So I don't think it's fair to do a hit on the Europeans on this front. Now, there is a very significant thing about the EU, which you mentioned, which is obviously the collection of 27 countries. Countries like Germany, countries like Sweden, countries like France, they have bilateral aid. That means going from their government to other countries, but they're also contributors to the EU-wide effort. Here's the thing. The EU does 7-year budgets. It's an enormous haggle to get the budget agreed, but the current EU budget runs till 2028, and it's not being cut. And the proposal from the European Commission, which is like the civil service of the European Union, they've proposed a new budget running from 2028 to 2035, 7-year budget, that will actually increase their international development assistance and their international humanitarian assistance. So it's quite interesting that while the UK, Germany, actually France as well, are cutting their bilateral budgets, the overall EU commitment, the proposal is to increase it. And we're counting on that to hold the line, if you like, because if they don't hold the line, then we really are in the most desperate trouble. The US represented $1 in every 3. The European Union and the European countries together represent about $1 in every 3 of the total aid budget. So we're really having to count on those countries. Your listeners may be wondering who else is contributing. Japan is a very significant contributor. Canada, quite a big contributor, but actually being reduced. I'm going to be in Ottawa meeting Prime Minister Carney on Friday to discuss that. But I think that the European picture is one where some European countries are going down. Other European countries are actually sustaining. Denmark is a good example. But the European Union as a whole has this long-term view about the signal importance of having European political sway, but also humanitarian and development aid sway in the equation. They see that as the critical part of their soft power. And of course, it's worth saying, your listeners may be wondering this as well. How does Ukraine fit into this? Ukraine is in the top 20. Ukraine, the military side previously was picked up by the Americans. Now it's being picked up by the Europeans. The economic and humanitarian funding was always predominantly European, and that's being sustained.
Why is Canada cutting back on foreign aid? When you mentioned that a minute ago, that might have surprised people, considering the way Canada is trying to be, kind of a counterpoint to the U.S. in various ways.
Yeah, Canada's feeling the squeeze. I mean, they're obviously under huge economic pressure because of the trade, quote unquote, war that's started, the tariffs that have come in, and so they're feeling the pinch. I think that's what they would say. Obviously, I'm not representing Canada, but that's what they would say.
So a downstream effect of tariffs that we may not have ever brought up on this show before, or people may not have thought of. I want to take a phone call for you from Richard in Cold Spring, New York, who maybe is skeptical of some of this. Richard, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Good. What you got?
Good morning. Two things. What is the appropriate level for the United States to be donating to these causes? And in the statistics, are they counting the bilateral aid that we give? Is Ukraine counted in those? And maybe even a third point, what about our own country? We have so much need here. The need here is enormous. And I'm just going to say, during COVID, I raised $1 million of funds for people in the Hudson Valley. And I saw things that were just horrific in this, heartbreaking in this area. So Those 3 points.
Those are
Richard,
good questions, but I really
thank
appreciate
you.
Thank
Go
you
ahead,
very much.
David.
What I would always say is, of course, charity begins at home, which is your last point. But the question that we would pose is, well, it shouldn't end at home. And it's interesting that when you ask the American public, 89% of the American public, 84% of Republicans, 94% of Democrats, they say, yeah, about 1% of the global federal budget should go on foreign aid. So to your point, $99 goes to places like Cold Spring and elsewhere that's in need in America. $1 goes abroad. That's what the American public say. And that was the level, more or less, of American international aid spending before the cuts. So the problem is that a majority of Americans think that 20% of the federal budget goes on foreign aid. That's not true. It's always historically been around 1%, which most Americans think $99 at home, $1 abroad makes, give or take, some sense. What we're now seeing is a retrenchment from that level. So in answer to your question, what would be the right amount? The official international answer is that aid should aim for 0.7% of total national income. So the national income of the United States is, give or take, $30 trillion. If you figure out from that the U.S. 0.7% would be in the $20 billion range. But you asked me what should be the level. That's the main level. One thing, if you're interested in this, I gave a speech about this at the University of Notre Dame recently. Historically, we've talked about development aid to help poor countries get on their own 2 feet and help poor people in those countries. In the main, economic development isn't powered by international aid. International economic development depends on markets that work. It depends on cracking down on corruption. It depends on having proper governance and real property rights in a country. Countries like South Korea or even China have shown aspects of that. India is showing that in various ways. Aid should be to tackle poverty amongst the poorest people in the world. And more than half of the poorest people in the world are now in conflict states of the kind that are documented in our watch list. And just to give you a sense of the proportions of this, the 20 countries in our watch list, which includes Ukraine, because you asked about that, the 20 countries in that watch list, they are 12% of the global population, but 85% of those in humanitarian need. So if we targeted the aid budget at the poverty that exists, the desperate, extreme poverty that exists among those people whose countries are racked by war and disaster, we do a hell of a job at reaching those most in need. The difficulty at the moment is only about a quarter of the global aid budget goes on those fragile and conflict states.
You know, the polling that you mentioned is so interesting, and I will note that at least three of the callers on our board are raising this question that Richard in Cold Spring just raised about the U.S. needing to spend money on people here. There's plenty of suffering of people here. That's one of the premises of the idea of America First, right? That we're spending too much money on other countries that are getting over on us in that respect. But the polling that you mentioned is so interesting. I've watched this over time. When you ask people in general, what do you think about foreign aid? It polls very poorly. But when you cite that actual stat, what do you think if the U.S. spends 1% of the federal budget on foreign aid, then it polls very well? That's an interesting contrast, right?
Isn't it? It speaks to the fact that people haven't given away either their heart or their head. Because remember, my argument is in part a moral argument. Those with something should give something. But it's also a strategic argument. One of the points in our report, there have been 57 outbreaks of measles around the world. These diseases that are either coming back or are new diseases, they don't respect borders. We'd better watch out. This is a very connected world. So there's a hard-headed argument as well as a big-hearted argument for why it makes sense to put that $1 out of every 100 towards problems that are beyond your own borders. Because what we know is that problems beyond our own borders, if they're allowed to fester, they don't stay a long way away.
Besides cutting back on vaccine distribution, we may also be exporting the mindset that helps measles to spread, but that's a different show. And on this idea of China filling the void, which we referenced briefly, and I want to come back to it for a sec, this is where it also gets complicated from a U.S. national interest perspective, right? A main foreign policy goal of the Trump administration is countering China's growing influence in the world, in the Western Hemisphere especially, but not only. So what is China doing as the U.S. steps back from humanitarian aid?
So this is a great point, and I want to try and explain it properly, because the Chinese are being gifted the playing field in various ways here. Let me give you two interesting straws in the wind, because historically, China has always presented itself as a quote-unquote developing country. In other words, a poor country. It should be receiving funds rather than just giving funds. It's historically been the head of the group of developing countries in the United Nations. It's called the Group of 77, the G77 group. But there's two interesting straws in the wind. Number one, the Trump administration has decided to withdraw from the World Health Organization. Surprise, surprise, who's doubling down on their investment of people and funds into the World Health Organization? Well, China is. And so there's an obvious filling of the vacuum there. The second thing, and this was in my head, you referenced the interview I did on the Morning Joe show before it was sensible for anyone to bed this morning at a very early hour. I referenced China there because there was an interesting story 2 weeks ago. Who's giving $100 million to humanitarian aid in Gaza? Well, China is. And historically, China has been reticent about getting into the humanitarian aid business, but I thought those are two interesting straws in the wind. And there is geopolitics here. There is global politics in this. My argument as the head of a non-governmental organization, an aid agency, is we should give the aid because it can help the people. But there's undoubtedly big global politics in this. And that's not a new thing. When John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, set up the USAID, he saw it in its global context, not just in its moral context.
We'll continue with David Miliband in a minute. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. We continue with David Miliband, former UK Foreign Secretary, now President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. The IRC's report, The New World Disorder, is just out this morning on that geopolitics, but also documenting what they call a global collapse in funding for humanitarian crises. 50% collapse just since last year is the stat they have, and including their annual watch list of the countries most at humanitarian crisis risk. And still, you can call or text with stories from any country you have ties to, or with other comments or questions, 212-433-WNYC. And let's get to the watch list itself. Countries most at risk, there is a top 5 here. Number 1, Sudan. Number 2, occupied Palestinian territory, as you refer to it. Number 3, South Sudan. Number 4, Ethiopia. And number 5 is Haiti. And we're getting a caller with ties to Haiti, so I want to take Howard in Brooklyn right now on that number 5 country on your watch list. Howard, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Thank you, Wyatt, for taking my call. I just want to say, what is the reason United States knows that Haiti has been there, fought for them to win their independence during the Lafayette time, and also helped them to get Louisiana Purchase, a lot of other states. Besides that, Haiti also have a lot of other countries in the world, and leading billions of people today get a better life. Whether you black, whether you Latinos, whether you women or white, their ancestors used to be poor, who are rich today, have PhD level. They all happened after the Haitian Revolution. Now, right now, United States paid $200 million to Kenyan government for some of the Kenyan to be in Haiti. Canada paid $100 million. So that $200 million should have spent in our American brothers and sisters in this country. And what does Kenyan do in Haiti?
And you're talking about a Kenyan-based security force, I think, right?
Yeah, but they don't do nothing in Haiti. People, the gang still burning people's house, killing people, put them in the street to sleep, and then they keep paying them. That's number 2.
Howard, I'm going to leave it there. I hear you. David's going to respond to that. We have another call who's Haitian, George in Hempstead, and I want to bring him in on this. George, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Yes, thank you for having me. One of the issues that I want to discuss is that foreign aid needs to be rethought, because one of the things is that two things that I have noticed, and I'm from Haiti, I used to see it myself. Number one, the government abdicated of its responsibility vis-à-vis the people. The foreign aid will take care of them, so we don't have to take care of them. In addition to that, there was a great deal of corruption. I used to go to the market and see food donated by USAID in the bag. They didn't even take them out of the bag. Gifts of the American people not to be sold. And they did nothing about it. They don't call the government to say, well, you shouldn't be selling that food. You should be going to the people.
George, thank you very much. And David, really those two callers, originally from Haiti, are making kind of the same point. The money that the U.S. spends on this country that you list as the fifth most vulnerable in the world to humanitarian crisis is at very least not being put to good use.
Well, I think there are a number of points there. First, it's very, very important to take head on this aid diversion stroke corruption issue. What I can speak to is that every penny that goes into the International Rescue Committee is dedicated to giving the most impactful services that deliver the greatest benefit to clients. And the rigor with which we follow the money that comes in, the goods and medicines that we supply, that we buy, the supply routes, and then that we make sure that they reach the people who need them, and they report back to us if they're not delivered. So I think it's absolutely right to take head on this corruption issue, the aid diversion issue. We do take it seriously. Obviously, I don't know the individual case that was raised. Secondly, there's a broader question here, which is these are long-term conflicts. And the stabilization force that the first caller, Howard, referred to, you picked this up, Brian, the Kenyans are leading an internationally mandated force, but they're hamstrung by the following issue. There's a big difference between peacemaking and peacekeeping. A peacekeeping force goes in when there's an agreement. A peacemaking force has to enforce order. That's a very different matter. It's one that this Kenyan force doesn't have the authority to do. And the gang violence that's being referred to is absolutely right. Third point and final point, I just want to make this so that people realize this. The number of people in humanitarian need in Haiti is about 6.4 million people. I mean, it's a big crisis that is way off the radar of far too many people. Our approach as a humanitarian organization is to say, if you don't treat the humanitarian side of this, if you allow people in desperation, you're going to make the politics worse. And that's the cycle that we're seeing, and it's a cycle that the watch list is drawing attention to.
I know you have about 5 more minutes with us. I want to make sure to get to 2 other places in the world that are on your watch list. Number 2 was what you call occupied Palestinian territory. I'm curious, how much is the IRC involved in Gaza, and is the ceasefire there, though imperfect, improving the humanitarian situation as you see it?
Let me just explain, first of all, because you've raised this twice now, this question of why we use the designation occupied Palestinian territory. And I want to speak to that directly. That is a reference to Gaza and to the West Bank. And it's the official designation that's used by the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. So we as IRC are not making some kind of political point in using that designation. It's the official terminology that's used across the humanitarian sector. We're not taking a position one way or the other. We're reflecting the fact that it's Gaza and the West Bank. And we use 74 different quantitative and qualitative indicators. And those 2 places are on the watch list because, according to our own data, they represent grave danger of humanitarian crisis over the year ahead. You then asked, has the ceasefire improved the situation? The short answer to that is yes, because when the violence was going on, it was practically impossible to get any goods and supplies in. Now, as a part of the ceasefire agreement, there was the ambition that 600 trucks a day of humanitarian aid would go in. It's not a great way of measuring humanitarian aid because obviously the important question is, well, what was in the trucks, not just whether or not the trucks went in.
And did they reach the people?
Yeah, but that as well, how much goes in and how much reaches the people. As a proxy, about 200 trucks a day are going in at the moment. So there's been some improvement. Some of the malnutrition that we were highlighting earlier in the year is being, including among some of our own staff members' families, is being addressed. So there's been some improvement. But obviously, you've still got 2 million people living in the west side of the western half of Gaza in very, very difficult conditions. And you have ongoing, in fact, rising violence in the West Bank. So it remains a critical situation, and that's why it's number 2 on the watch list.
And the one other country that I want to make sure to get to in this conversation that's in your top 20 is Afghanistan. And this gets us to another U.S. policy question. Since the shooting of the 2 National Guard members in Washington, D.C., apparently by somebody who was an Afghan national who would help the U.S. in the war effort and was brought here and was vetted by both the Biden and the Trump administration, but apparently had serious mental health problems. After that individual case, the U.S. has announced a crackdown on legal immigration from Afghanistan. NPR has a story just this morning called "Republicans Are Divided on Afghan Immigrant Policy After the National Guard Shooting." So can you comment on that through the lens of the IRC's interest in protection of refugees or in the situation on the ground in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan?
Yes, I'll comment both on the situation in Afghanistan and the situation of those Afghans who were entitled to come to the U.S. as refugees because they had worked with the U.S. while it was in Afghanistan and therefore could feel themselves under threat from the new authorities. I can address both sides of that. The situation on the ground in Afghanistan is above all an economic and political crisis now, rather than a security crisis. The security situation is much improved because the war is over, obviously. But the political and economic circumstances in the country remain very, very challenged. I did a session with our own women employees group in Afghanistan 2 weeks ago, and harrowing stories of the situation on the ground. In that context, it feels dreadful that there should have been such a reduction in fact, a complete abolition of all U.S. Development and humanitarian support for the Afghan people. I say that deliberately, for the Afghan people, not for the Afghan government. And those 300,000 boys and girls who were meant to be getting education from us as a result of the U.S. commitment, that's been lost overnight. So the situation on the ground is very, very challenging. In respect of those Afghans who did work with the U.S. and were entitled to something called a special immigrant visa, what I would say is that it would be absolutely tragic for one terrible case to poison the opportunities and rights of a whole country. And that's the danger. We would say that the SIV program is one, special immigrant visa program is one that's proved its worth. People have come to America because they were promised that they would be able to, and they've contributed to this country. And I live and work in New York. There have been Afghans relocated, resettled into New York, but across the country, they're making a positive contribution to this country. And having known the price of oppression, they know the value of freedom, and they're determined to make the most of it. And I think it would be absolutely tragic for a whole community to be damned as a result of the allegations against one person. I hope that, Brian, your listeners will have had their appetite whetted for reading more about the emergency watch list. If they visit our website, rescue.org, they can dig into all the work that we're doing, both in America and around the world, for people who are victims of war and disaster, which is what we do as an organization.
David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. We really appreciate that you keep coming on with us. Thank you for today.
Thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate you and your audience.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. So the murder was obviously shocking. President Trump's reaction to the murder was obviously shocking. But let's remember Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, who had a significant career of her own and were both murdered in their home over the weekend, presumably by their son, so it seems. So listeners, what was your favorite Rob Reiner movie or other thing that he did? Who else wants to remember Rob Reiner for anything else in particular? 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. This is Spinal Tap, Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men. Oh yeah, All in the Family.
This guy, and everybody knows it, is always putting this country down. As far as he's concerned, nothing is right unless it's left.
Hey, I happen to believe in this country more than you do.
What was that?
That's right, because I believe it's strong enough to accept some changes.
Well, it ain't gonna accept communism, buddy.
Who's talking about communism? I'm talking about civil rights.
That's communism.
You know something? Your thinking is really Neanderthal.
Listen, if you're gonna talk to me, talk American or clam up.
Rob Reiner and Carol O'Connor in the old classic sitcom All in the Family. With us, Richard Rushfield, chief columnist at The Ankler. Richard, thanks very much for joining us. Sorry under these circumstances. Welcome to WNYC.
Thanks very much for having me.
Let's just dive right into the middle of this. I mean, his acting and directing career spans such a wide range of genres. When you step back and look at it as a whole, do you see anything as a common thread or the thing that made a Rob Reiner film feel like a Rob Reiner film?
You know, the word that comes up with him, sort of on screen and off, about everything he did, everything he touched, every room he was in, was just humanity. That he just brought such a human, warm presence to everything he did, whether it was as an actor or as a director, or as a writer, or as an activist, and just a presence in Hollywood. And with All in the Family, that which was probably the biggest TV show of the 1970s, at a time when being a big TV show really meant something. It really hinged on that relationship between him as a young professor and his taxi driving father-in-law and Archie Bunker, and how they came to every episode they would find a way to relate and understand each other and have a larger concept of the world, and that is what held that show together. And he carried that through into his directing and his whole life beyond that.
Let's take a remembrance from Jules in Greenpoint. You're on WNYC. Jules, thank you for calling in.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I was probably don't speak for only myself, but I feel like there's a Rob Reiner movie for every decade of my life that's really close, from Princess Bride to most recently him in The Bear. But my big story was that the first day I ever went to school on my own, I took the bus. My dad put me on the bus, and he said, have fun storming the castle. And my 11-year-old is just now started to go to school on his own a little bit, and I think of that like every weekday.
So you're thinking like a Rob Reiner movie for every decade of your life.
Yeah, for sure. And now for my kid's life, too.
Yeah. Jules, thank you. Something similar, I think, from Virginia in Midwood. Virginia, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling. Virginia, you there?
Yes.
Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
Your
Should I turn off my radio?
Oh, yeah. Turn off your radio and then go for it with your remembrance of Rob Reiner.
Thank you, Brian. I grew up with All in the Family on the TV, and Meathead was the one that, spoke for us all. He was the voice of reason, so I kind of liked him. And then when I was in college, Spinal Tap came out, and I'd seen all the Beatles movies and the Led Zeppelin movies, and every in-joke was perfect. And I just thought, he can do this too? And then I just continued to like his work. I love Albert Brooks, and he made a movie about him. And I was just, for everybody, I work with kids who struggle with mental illness and addiction and stuff, and I just know a lot of people, and it just seemed like they, as parents, tried really, really hard. And it was just kind of heartbreaking that you can try that hard. And it can just sometimes not work. You can't save your kid.
I hear
That's
you,
all.
Virginia. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I hear how you're relating, but to the tragedy. But also, the first two callers had a similar theme of Rob Reiner related through so many genres and through so many generations. So here's a little montage from a number of his films, some of the famous lines.
You can't handle the truth.
Hello! My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
I'll have what she's having.
There we go. So, Richard, you wanna comment on either the callers or that was less there in the montage than I realized there was going to be, but you still get the idea.
He was almost a classic Hollywood filmmaker, and that's why for a lot of people this is feeling like sort of a passing of old Hollywood. He just was a great storyteller. He wasn't a sort of pompous auteur, but he told these stories with wit and intelligence, and they were dismissed at the time by some as sort of middlebrow, but you can see now they were sort of great storytelling. They never talked down to anyone, and whether it's great rom-com or courtroom drama like A Few Good Men, he just applied with wit and humanity to everything he did, and just touched so many people in so many ways.
Joni in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Joni.
Hi, Brian. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and I just wanted to say I think Rob Reiner is an incredible filmmaker, and I was hoping we'd get another film from him. But I went to photo school with Michelle back in the day, Michelle Singer.
Uh-huh. You want to say anything about
and
her?
She was a powerhouse, even back then. My friend Sheila and I would hang out with her, and she was a very daring photographer, so I was thrilled when I saw that she was photographing in movies.
Somebody told me that she shot the cover of Trump's book, The Art of the Deal. Do you know that to be true?
Wow.
I
do not know that to be true.
Joni, thank you for your call. Richard?
Yeah, I believe that that is true. And the famous story that he told also is that he wrote Harry Met Sally. It had sort of a sad ending of them separating he was divorced and going through a difficult time about the impossibility of romantic relationships. And then he met her she was working on the set of it and fell in love and realized he had to change the ending to a happy ending because he saw that romantic relationships were possible.
And I don't want to ignore Rob Reiner as a public political figure. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you in a second how his activism intersected with his filmmaking, but I think we have to at least mention this, what even a lot of Republicans are calling really grotesque reaction from President Trump when he posted, quote, "A very sad thing happened last night in Hollywood. Rob Reiner, a tortured and struggling but once very talented movie director and comedy star, has passed away together with his wife Michelle, reportedly due to the anger he caused others through his massive, unyielding, and incurable affliction with a mind-crippling disease known as Trump derangement syndrome." And it goes on from there. Obviously, there is no reporting that indicates that he died from. The implication there is that he inspired his son to be angry at him because he had Trump derangement syndrome. I mean, oh my God.
I mean, this is such a horrific tragedy of a person who was such a symbol of kindness and decency and warmth to come to such a horrible end. You just can't imagine anything worse. And for anybody to have a reaction like that is just, you just can't imagine that anyone's humanity could be so twisted that would be your response. And to have that come from the President of the United States is just unbelievable.
Who's supposed to be the healer in chief, and what else can we say? So did Rob Reiner's activism intersect with his films?
Yeah, well, I think as later on his activism grew and he was sort of less focused on his filmmaking, but his films are very much about sort of a capital P progressive ideal of government doing good for people and helping others. And he became very involved, and he was, as activists go, he was incredibly consequential. He led to a actually got a ballot proposition passed here in California that in the 1990s that raised the cigarette taxes and used the money to fund early education. So he was very consequential and very involved. He was not just a dilettante. He took what he did seriously, and he did it with a real sort of passion and goodness to him.
We have a minute left. Let's see if we can get one or two more callers in with remembrances. Zool in Manhattan. Can you do it in 20 seconds?
I can. Rob's death in the midst of all the violence throughout the world this weekend is heartbreaking and really shows that perhaps, this is all rooted in mental illness and sociopathy. I worked on Harry Met Sally. Rob would never say that. He would say, we made Harry Met Sally. He was gentle, loving, and a real working class hero.
Thank you. And one more, Julio in the Bronx. We have 20 seconds for you.
How are you? It's a pleasure. This is a real big sad moment in Hollywood. My favorite part, though, as a current casting that he did was with Wolf of Wall Street. And it's sad to say that kind of tantalizes with the reality that happened. You had Leonardo DiCaprio, who was his son in that movie, who, again, had his own struggles with success that brought him to parts of his life that, in the story probably wasn't so happy, right?
Right. Thank you very much. Callers, thank you. And Richard Rushfield, chief columnist at The Ankler, which covers the entertainment industry. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Brian Lehrer Weekend. We're back on the radio Monday morning at 10 a.m. In the meantime, follow us on Blue Sky at The Brian Lehrer Show, where there's always a conversation 24/7.